I will never stop screaming from the mountaintops that interracial relationships do not cure racism. I grew up with a dad who's not Black, and the amount of anti-Blackness that existed in my home, I wasn't allowed to wear braids in my hair because they're ghetto. Wasn't allowed to have nicknames because they're ghetto. They used to make me scrub my knees and my elbows and overall my skin because it was too Black. I had this friend in elementary that I used to hang out with named Chelsea, and I was told that I couldn't hang out with Chelsea the first time they met her because she was too Black.
Wow. She said a lot. That's the kind of stuff that had people in therapy. Wow, I was her own dad. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. I've heard this like kumbaya idea just is on the more people mix, the more interracial sex that they have, or the more people marry, that's going to somehow end racism. And I'm like, if you understand anything about American history, you know that here's nothing. Because there's always been interaction. Like Black women are very much like the mistress class in America. Like they've always had that, unfortunately, in the West, they've always had that role, or they've always had that place in society with respect to Black men. This is particularly why, in my opinion, shows like Scandal were so popular, because it was pulling on these old historical stereotypes. This powerful white man with this Black mistress, right? This kind of like forbidden kind of relationship. So, and again, those are old historical tropes. We have to remember, like, highly, deeply racist slave owners would have relationships with slaves who they considered property, not even humans. Sometimes they would actually have like sometimes these romantic engagements, but it was still very racist because it was still very clear that was his property, or that was his mistress. She was never going to be on the level of his wife, or like the lady of the house, the lady of the legacy. If you just understand American history and what interracial relationships have been, and how in many ways they've been used to actually maintain subjugation of Black people, and specifically Black women, then you would never come to that conclusion. You would actually understand that sometimes people use interracial relationships to actually perpetuate white supremacy. Let's go back to the famous math equation from Thomas Jefferson, who literally created a math equation on how to breed out Blackness by consistently and systematically interbreeding Black people with white people. And his theory was that, like, over time, if you take a Black person and you have them mix with a white person, and then the descendants of that white person continues to mix with Black people, eventually Blackness will breed out. That was his problem on how to solve the Negro problem. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if you just understand American history and like what was going on in the plantation and even in Jim Crow and past that, with all of the racial and unfortunately the sexual violence, you know, and the raping and stuff that was going on, like, relationships alone, sex alone doesn't change anything. And by the way, in the midst of that, in the midst of Jim Crow, like, there was forbidden romances. There were, like I said, there were historical accounts of Black women who were sleeping with members of the KKK. I'm trying to think, was it Joseph E. Hull? I'm trying to think. It was some Black historian. I can't think of their name, but there was a Black historian who mentioned it in one of his books. But again, I'm just trying to reiterate a point that sex means nothing. It does not equate to love and value of another person's individuality, or even their ethnicity or their racial background. Sometimes it's just a fetish.
As an insult, one time, my dad told me that I look like I'm gonna date Black men. He looked at my brother and said my brother is the one thing he hates, and when I said, "What's that?" he said, "A Black man." And I'm just gonna throw out there that he only dates Black women. Who he called the N-word anytime he got upset.
This is such a stereotype. They talk about the tragic mulatto syndrome. And again, I'm bringing these things up because these are literally historical tropes that show us that white people and Black people mixing doesn't automatically equate to racial equality. Like, you have to deal with the system, you have to deal with the mindsets, you have to deal with the things that are set up in order for that to happen. It's not just like they have sex and it's all equal, right? So the tribesman and mulatto, again, that's this idea of these literally like the byproducts, oftentimes, of white male slave owners and African enslaved women who produce these mulatto children. And these children oftentimes were kind of pulled between where do they fit in society. And depending upon the slave owner and who he was, would actually determine the outcome of the mulatto, right, or the mixed child. Because I think mulatto ended up being, my understanding, a racialized term, which was actually considered a derogatory term. The slave owner's desires is ultimately what would determine the destiny of the mixed child. So in some instances, you had slave owners who would maybe allow the children to learn how to read, would give them education, would even give them access to certain resources. In other instances, they didn't acknowledge them at all. They just would have them be house slaves, pretty much. And sometimes they would even do inappropriate things with their offspring because they still considered them property. There was oftentimes this push and pull because they were never ever accepted into white society because they weren't white enough, unless they were able to somehow pass. They were able to pass and they would be integrated into it. But if they were not able to, they weren't Black enough to be in the field. They're oftentimes in the house. They were in these odd positions, but they never really had a stable place. It was a pull between, well, do I identify with my oppressed class? Do I try to assimilate in the white class that has the power and the wealth, but that doesn't really like me? Like, where do I fit? again, I'm saying these are old racialized tropes that completely debunk the idea that by nature of two people coming together, it's going to be equal, they're going to be free love and free equality, and there's not going to be racism. She's literally speaking to that. What she said about this white man only dating black women is actually not as surprising as she may think. What is strange to me is the black woman who decided to sit around and hear that stuff and hear themselves being called the N-word. And I think I'm at the point where I've realized that I think some black women just like that. Maybe it's like they're a weird fetish or something. Maybe they have to like that. I don't understand it. I think it's really strange. I don't know if it's like Stockholm syndrome. I don't get it. I think it's weird, but that is what I find actually more concerning or strange or confusing, is how like a black woman could consistently do that and like raise children and then know that she has a husband who hates her offspring who is male. And that mixed black child mix is still going to be seen as a black man. And that's literally like this white man had a mixed child, or this was raising one mixed child, still see him as a black man. It don't matter what kind of European, he's still a Negro. You know what I mean? So crazy stuff.
Anytime he got upset. I once sat in courts for 30 minutes because my aunt refused to let any of the black associates there help her. We had to wait for the one Indian man that worked there to come back. My dad defended Zimmerman.
That's something she will have to work out with the Lord in therapy, probably. And it's like, that's who her mom chose to procreate with. It didn't sound like it led to racial equality or parity. So that's her experience. Unfortunately, I feel like her experience is a little more common than what we want to admit, but it does certainly bring up an interesting point. Anyways, what do you guys think? What do y'all think about the whole video? I think that's kind of sad, but not surprising. Let me know down in the comment section. Thank you so much for listening if you've gotten this far, and we'll talk later. Bye.